I hope I'll get to talk briefly about a lot of things here later. What they were doing was keeping track of all of these wandering stars, which is what planet means, and they correlated them with various and sundry events. If the kingdom got invaded at a particular time, they would look to see all the different signs and omens that were going on. One of the interesting things that I found out recently in a lecture that's actually on YouTube with one of my teachers, Lee Lehman, she talks about how there was recently in Egypt a child born with two heads, and they were born with the heads in particular positions. And if you look back in some of the oracles, you will see that the Babylonians, Chaldeans, Sumerians, I forget which, but they had that written down as an oracle. And the oracle said if a child is born with two heads in these particular positions, then there will be land given up by the kingdom, something like that. And apparently at that point in Egypt, I think that was when Egypt lost the Sinai to Israel's invasion. So it was really interesting to see that some of these things correlated over time. But needless to say, they had people full-time looking at all of these things and finding the correlations and the omens, and this apparently is the origin for the earliest systems of astrology. Now, of course, astrology and astronomy were combined for quite some time. So really, when we're talking about ancient astronomy, we're talking about its practical application, astrology. There are quite a few modern astronomers who will try and tell you that, that there were astronomers that were really forced to do horoscopes in the Middle Ages in order to keep up their studies. But actually, if you look at most of those people writing, including people like Kepler, they were looking for more exact ways to do their astrology by doing the astronomy. So in many ways, astronomy was the handmaiden of the astrological concerns. Now, we have the asterisms and we have the patterns, but how did they keep track of these things? They didn't understand orbital mechanics. What they did understand, though, was that after so many days, there would be a loop in the orbit of Mars in certain ways, and they kept track of all of those things. So they could roughly predict where a planet was going to be because of their long pattern of establishing these observations. So they knew about retrograde motion. They could see where Mars was going to be. They knew that the loop was going to be so big in the sky and that after so many days it was going to go forward. So all of these started to be handed down over time. Now, the average person was not the subject of what became the first horoscopes. Really what they were doing was looking at what was going to go on with the kingdom and, of course, what was going to go on with the king. Because typically the fate of the ruler was considered to be intertwined with that of the kingdom. If your ruler died suddenly, you may have a crisis in the kingdom if, lineage is not established well, or if a coup is going to happen, whatever. So these two things were looked at, and the first horoscopes were of the king. Now, they started to establish things more and more exactly once the zodiac was put together, and that became the belt of the 12 figures that the planets seemed to move through. Let me mention briefly. You will hear modern astronomers, including Neil deGrasse Tyson, say that, astrologers have the zodiac all wrong. This is completely insulting because we've known that there are several different zodiacs, and we've known about motion of the spheres and all the rest for quite some time. There are actually 3 zodiacs. The one that you see up in the sky that has been mapped out by an astronomer in the early 20th century, actually, is called the constellational zodiac. That's the one where the astronomers have the nice boundaries set up in the heavens. You can look on the sky maps and all the rest. Tyson, when he says that there are 13 or 14 signs to the zodiac, is counting what the Frenchman did when Ophiuchus's foot dips down into the zodiac for maybe 5 degrees. Okay? So it's really only useful for that sense of where is a planet in the background of stars. Now, related to that somewhat is the sidereal zodiac, which takes some starting point, typically the first star in the nose of Aries as the beginning point, and then divides the sky up into 12 constellations, 12 signs of 30 degrees each. But even those sidereal zodiac users, which are some in the West and a lot in India, actually are not taking into account that Libra is a small sign and Virgo actually takes up more space. It is looking at an archetypal form, but their argument is that this archetypal form changes by 1 degree every 72 years. The other zodiac that's used is the Western tropical zodiac, which starts with where the sun comes across the one of the boundaries in the sky on about March 21st. That's a position which is tied in with archetypal forms, with hot, cold, wet, and dry and everything, which I had talked about last year, and is intimately tied in with the cosmology of the Western esoteric tradition. Now, the thing about that is that it does shift every 72 years with the background of stars, but if you're looking at where things are in an unchanging cycle, the background of stars is simply the origin from about 2,500 years ago for the names. And we're really looking at that pattern. By the way, one of the things that if you do get into an argument with an astronomer or somebody who knows astronomy, they keep track of things in the sky by declination, which is sort of like latitude and longitude, or latitude rather, on the Earth's sphere. The longitude, they don't take usually from the zodiac. They do something called right ascension. Fancy term, but really, if you ask them where is 0 hours, 0 minutes of right ascension, it is exactly the same point that astrologers in the West use to start the zodiac at Aries. And the astronomers actually have to change their maps like every 50 years. And you will see when you look at an official astronomical chart, of where the stars are, it will say epoch 1950, epoch 2000, because they correct just like the astrologers do. So it's one of the arguments you can use, saying, look, you guys are even using the zodiac, you're just not using it the same way. You use the same starting point. You just divide it up into 24. In any case, so we get all of that. We get the stars, we get the pattern of the stars, and where things are in a cyclic way. And then the other major element was discovered or found correlated with where are these things in the sky relative to their position on Earth. Are they below the horizon? Are they above the horizon? And that's where the other third thing in the sentence of astrology comes from, which is the houses. Okay? These were really formed much later. And there were a number of different house systems. The earliest is called whole sign houses. And you will see that whole sign houses are in a very real sense used in India and in the earliest Greek astrology, and they've actually been resurrected in modern times. A lot of astrologers are now using whole sign houses, especially since one of the top astrologers in the world, Rob Hand, has been promoting it. What's the deal with the houses? Well, if a planet is just about to rise, okay, it's below the horizon, like let's take the sun, okay? An hour before sunrise, you're starting to get a little bit more light and everything, but the sun has not shown up in the heavens yet. Well, that is the first house. Things have not come up yet, okay? When the sun rises, it will be in, usually, depending on your system, but usually the 12th house, okay? And the reason why they number these things in this way is, what's the first house to rise? Boom. Then the next house, the second one, the third one to rise, the fourth. And so it goes around counterclockwise as to the numbering, but clockwise as to how the whole sphere of the heavens moves, okay? Because that sphere of the heavens and that movement was critical, all right? If the moon is in the 7th house, to quote a song, then what that means is the moon's about to set, okay? It's over there about to go down, okay? Because it's in the 7th house. The whole sphere of the heavens is moving, and it's about to go down. Likewise, something that's in about the 10th house is culminating. Okay, when the sun's in the 10th house, it's getting pretty close to noon. When the sun is in the 4th house, directly opposite, it's close to midnight. All right, and then we have all of our differences with modern timekeeping and everything. So what wound up happening was they started to straighten out all of this, come up with a system, and I'll go deeper into the zodiac in a little bit. And they started to say, okay, what's happening? Where are the planets' positions in relation to the horizon and all the rest when all these things happen? Oh, let's take a look at the time that the king is born, and we'll do a map of the sky for when the king is born. And then they started to see planets, movement, and all the rest. Now, what wound up happening was that system then spread east and west. You will hear and talk to people in the Vedic tradition, Indian astrology, who will say, oh, our astrology is, 5,000 years old or something like this. Well, not exactly. Because if you translate the very first book, the earliest book we have in the Hindu tradition, it translates as the book of Greek astrology. Okay. Why? Because there was quite a bit of travel back and forth between these sides. Now, keep in mind, in India, things did develop after that in very different directions. But they mostly kept the whole sign houses. They kept with the sidereal zodiac, where they have to keep adjusting that. And of course, there were fights as to how much you adjust for every few years. So there are astrologers that use one system versus another in India. And then they had whole complex systems otherwise. But they also have a really wonderful, if you talk to an Indian astrologer, oftentimes they're really, really good at prediction. Sometimes they are scary good. You can come in, and I've heard stories of going into an Indian astrologer, telling them your birth data, and they come back and they tell you the names of your kids. This is really, this is a level we haven't quite met in the West yet. But they have other systems of prediction that are used in the West, and I'll go a little bit into that as to what happened. So this stuff traveled to the east, traveled to the west, landed in Greece, and the earliest Greek writings that we have do not reflect any understanding of astrology. It really did come in later. I think, and this is where my memory is a little shaky, it may be around 300 BC, something like that. So the big flowering of Greek civilization occurred, and later on we get astrology being kind of pasted onto that from the people doing their travels and all the rest. But the Greeks really ran with it, and they started to codify things, and we do have some of those writings which are fortunately starting to be translated, a good number of them translated into modern languages. Now, what wound up happening was the Greek astrologers set up things. They had their way of seeing things, which was totally imbued with their philosophy of the time. And what wound up happening was one particular person, one particular group of writings managed to survive the best to be looked at and to be studied in the West. and that was a guy named, any takers? Ptolemy, okay? He had his 4 books on astronomy, or 4 books on astrology. Now, what wound up happening was, his stuff got grabbed by the Arabs, was worked with. The Greek stuff was grabbed by the Arabs also. The Arabs did a wonderful job of holding on to the tradition and translating things. And as many of you know, a lot of the Greek writings would have been lost if it hadn't been for Arab translations and preservation. But what wound up happening was, especially in later times and in the 19th and 20th century, Ptolemy was about it for astrology. And there were people that were just total Ptolemy loyalists and read sometimes bad translations and misunderstood things. For one thing, Ptolemy was a really great chronicler of information, but it does not look like he was much of a working astrologer. The other thing is, he never even mentioned what a planet in a sign means. Okay? In modern astrology books, you'll get, Moon in Scorpio means this and whatnot. No, Ptolemy didn't even mention any of that stuff. Okay? As a matter of fact, the astrology that's done nowadays is actually somewhat more related to a watered-down version of a contemporary of his called Vettius Valens. Okay? Now, if you want to really start from the beginning, someone has just done a translation and put it up on the net of Vettius Valens, if you look him up. And they did a great job of that. There have, about 15, 20 years ago, there were other translations of Vettius that astrologers have done. But it's nice to get some other versions of that out. And you get a lot more of what looks like modern astrology from some of that. Yeah?
Can I just interject real quick? I talked about Vettius Valens earlier this week because he's also the earliest source for our ideas of the planetary hours.
Sure.
That's where that comes from.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And the planetary hours are critical with the Chaldean order, which I'll get into.
Cool.
So, all of this stuff preserved by the Arabs. We still have some of the wonderful stuff that the Arabs wrote, which was then translated into Latin, okay, and became some of the flowering of astrology in the West when the Arabs invaded and took over the Iberian Peninsula, and then all of that knowledge was starting to move into the West, along with things like geomancy and their systems of medicine, which I always thought it was interesting that during the Crusades, the Crusaders noticed that some of the same fighters were back much quicker on the battlefield than a lot of the Western Christian fighters, mostly because the Arabs had better medicine and got them recovered and back to battle sooner. They took note of these things, and once things settled down, a lot of that knowledge, especially the medical stuff, started to flow into the West. So, now, let's take a look at, if I'm continuing to follow my outline here, hoping to get through all of this. The medieval Renaissance worldview. One of the critical things that you will see, of course, is geocentrism. The idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe, or at least of the solar system. There was once I think it was a graduate astronomy student who said, somebody was saying something about geocentrism, and the graduate student disparagingly said, yes, they were so stupid back then. At which point an aged astronomer said, yes, I wonder what the universe would look like from that viewpoint. At which point he was really shooting down the guy, because that was the observation viewpoint. It was the logical way to look at things. And yes, a lot of people will disparage current astrology for being geocentric, but we're living on the Earth, folks. We're looking at the correlations of what's going on from our viewpoint. One of the other little secrets that you won't be told is that when NASA is planning on shooting off a rocket and going somewhere, they have to do geocentric astronomy because they're shooting the rocket off from the Earth. Their mathematics has to take that into account. They're not blasting off from the sun. So, you know, it's all in your viewpoint, which was, of course, later reflected by Einstein, but that's ahead of time. So, what is it that they saw from that viewpoint on the Earth? Well, they thought the Earth was basically immovable. And they did know that the Earth was round and that the Earth was a ball. That is one of the things that modern, especially American history teachers are incorrect about, because the knowledge of the Earth being round has been known since ancient times, if nothing else because of the shadow of the Earth on the moon during lunar eclipses. But be that as it may, the celestial sphere was seen as moving around, and that there were various spheres in between the sphere of the stars and the Earth. So what do we have there? Well, in the grossest sense, we have the upper airs were thought to be fiery. Well, you got the sun up there, and you got these things that are shining, and the most common source for light was something that was burning. So we have air, or we have fire up there. Then we have air, obviously because you had the winds and the clouds. Then next came the sphere of water, which sat upon the Earth. So you have the each of those four then becomes reflective of the four elements. And interestingly enough, for those of you who might be wandering into the realm of geomancy, that's also the order that the little dots are seen in geomantic divination. But we have those spheres, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the ionosphere in modern scientific parlance, okay? And they're trying to make sense of all this. So what's next right above the Earth? Well, there was the wind, the clouds, and all the rest, but you obviously saw the moon going around. So you have Earth here. You have the moon is the next thing up, okay? And then it got a little bit complicated. Get that later. It got a little bit complicated, but they saw the next thing out from the Earth, the moon, as being Mercury. The next sphere out, Venus. And then came the sun. Then came Mars. Then came Jupiter. And finally Saturn. Now each of these had a number of years or months that they went around. The moon obviously taking some 28 days, depending on how you look at it and what angles. Mercury and Venus were closely tied in with the sun, but sometimes they could get around a little quicker. The sun then taking 365 and a quarter days. Mars about a year and a half. Jupiter 12 years, and Saturn 29 years. Now, I know that some people here are familiar with Kabbalah. And I'd like you to look at this diagram of the spheres and notice, if you were to take the 10 Sephirah, what planets are related to each of the spheres on the Sephirah? It's the same pattern. Yeah, same pattern. We get all the way up to Binah in the third, and then you get to transcendent types of things. So yet another point where this pattern is found. And as Bill mentioned earlier, this is the same pattern that's used to determine the planetary hours. So this is one of the critical things. It also apparently is the order of initiation in the Mithraic mysteries, okay? Because you have planetary initiations and you were working your way up the spheres as you were ascending your soul to a higher level. So all of this stuff, you know, if you just know this one fact, it can point to a lot of other things in the tradition. Question?
Regarding that organization, there is a discrepancy, though, in where you place Saturn and Luna between the Palladian and the Ptolemaic order. How would you reconcile that in, let's just say, initiatic terms?
You know, it's interesting because if you look at all of this, I don't know. I've been so imbued with the tree of life, you know.
As have we all.
Yeah, that's the best way for me to look at it. You know what? That's really good. Let me look that up, and I'll tell you next year if you have me back.
All right.
Okay, that's a really good point, and I'll admit to ignorance on thinking about that, but it'll be a good stretch for me. All right. So, finding this pattern imbued in a lot of different places, we now get to, okay, so just briefly, what do these planets mean? Okay, some of what they mean has to do with their patterns in hot and cold. Okay, just briefly, planets that were closer to the sun were thought to be a little bit warmer. Okay, Mars, Jupiter still somewhat, Saturn really cold because it was the furthest away. Okay, the moon was thought of as being damp and moist, you know. Mercury, as always, a little bit of each and a little bit of everything, you know. So a lot of these patterns and a lot of the meanings were connected up with some of those very elemental forms. All right. So if you look in modern astrology books, you will see that the planets have certain attributes, but they're largely psychological. All right. We'll get into why it became psychological in a while, but if you look at the older books, like if you get a copy of Lily, all right, you will see that these things had attributes. There were long lists of correspondences with these planets. From there, you kind of get a sense of what the planet means, but they were looking at much more concrete applications for the planets and indeed the signs of the zodiac. You know, that this rules this, that this metal is connected with this. You know, you get everything from, what is it? Just for metals, it's lead for Saturn, tin for Jupiter, and by the way, anybody can find any tin. I don't know, they closed the last tin mine, I think, in England just recently, so I just don't know where to get a hold of tin anymore. eBay? Yeah, maybe.
No, seriously.
Okay, all right. I'll have to look. Mars for iron, the sun for gold, Venus for copper, Mercury, of course, Mercury, and the moon is usually attributed to silver. But there are other things that are connected in too. So that's just a simple correspondence. So we've got these planets, they're moving around the Earth in various ways, all right? And then what about this cycle? What about these things that are these things that are called the signs? Okay. The signs themselves have a pattern, which once you get an idea of it, you can start to get basic meanings. One of the patterns is beginning, middle, and end. Okay? Okay, if you want to think of it as a curve, or maybe you want to think of it as the beginning, the start of something, the first initial energy, the middle where you're trying to hang on, and the end where you're letting go. Of course, in astrology, there's a term for that. There's hundreds. As a matter of fact, there's some really good astrology dictionaries out there, because there's so many terms for so many. It's cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So what happens with these? Well, the cardinal signs have a tendency to be pushing, to have the initial energy, to have a fairly pure form of it. The fixed signs are wanting to hang on, not change. And the mutable signs have a tendency to be changeable because they're about to get set and move into something else. All right? Yeah, I know this goes and reflects into some of Aristotle's ideas and things like that. But pretty basic, and you know, it's human experience too. You know, you start off a race, you put all your energy into getting going, then you're trying to hang on, And then towards the end, you're starting to peter out and get to the point of changing, okay, into the next phase, which is probably falling on the ground if it was me. So that pattern is imbued in these signs, starting with Aries, cardinal, fixed, mutable, and so on, all the way around. Cardinal, fixed, mutable, cardinal, fixed, mutable. And so every one of those signs that has the same designation has a similarity in that sense. Okay? All the cardinal signs start things off. All the fixed signs are more rigid. The mutable ones have a certain amount of flexibility. All right? And then, so we have this threefold division, and we also have the elements. All right? We have earth, air, fire, and water. And once you combine those, you then get this 12-fold pattern. That's all that it is. Okay? These two cycles are kind of combining, and in such a wonderful way that you can get an idea. Which is which? Well, we have Aries here is fire, and I'm going to use the old symbols. And if you don't know these symbols, I'll give you the quick mnemonic for them. These are the elemental symbols. Upward pointed triangle for fire, just like a bonfire. Here we have earth. The mnemonic for this, really cute. It's a downward pointing triangle, and if you see the line as being the horizon, it's pointing down into the earth. Okay, real simple. Over here we have air. Same thing, except it's pointing up into the air. Okay, and water. If you've ever been to one of those old fountains and seen one of those paper cups that are triangular, okay? Hey, it works, okay?
Whatever works.
Yeah, so, I know, but that was a really helpful for me as a mnemonic to remember these symbols, okay? So that pattern continues all the way through, and we have the standard attributes of those four elements. So let's take and bounce around just a little bit here. So let's look at Scorpio, okay? That's a fixed sign, and it's water. Okay, fixed. It doesn't want to change very much. It's water, but it has to do with things like the unconscious and depth and that sort of thing. So what do you get when you have a lot of Scorpio? Okay, you've got something that doesn't want to move much, okay, but also is very deep. And you will find that people with a lot of Scorpio in their chart, notice I am not saying Scorpios because I'm avoiding sun sign language, okay? I'll tell you why sun signs are, yeah, he said it. But if you have a lot of Scorpio energy, you have a lot of ability to get into the depth, to look behind things, to see what's peeking behind, because think of waters that are extremely still, in fact, maybe stagnant, okay, with a lot of depth to them. Okay, sort of, and if you get that kind of Lovecraft feeling, that's probably appropriate in some ways to Scorpio, okay? So, let's pick on another sign. We have another fixed sign, which is Leo, okay? Fixed, fire that wants to keep burning brightly. Okay? Fire that's out there, fire that's extroverted, fire that is, attention grabbing, okay? Fire that is like a great actor or actress who loves all that attention, okay? Fire that is extremely gregarious. So a lot of people with Leo in their chart, critical stuff, can be very out there and very great with groups of people. But each one of these also has their weakness. If you ignore a Leo, it just pisses them off terribly. Okay, it's one of the ways that you can really grab them. So that's fixed. Let's look at some of the cardinals. Like Aries, cardinal fire. Okay, when does that occur? March 21st. Okay. The middle of spring, by the way, not the beginning of spring. Okay, one of my bugaboos. Everybody in the West seems to think that the seasons start at a totally wrong time. Just look at Shakespeare. Midsummer Night's Dream is June 21st, not the beginning of summer. In any case, shorthand. Aries, beginning fire, the very beginning for the sense of that power that's needed to get spring really moving, okay? The first spark of something, the first point in any cycle, okay? And I really do want to emphasize that point. If you think of and watch anything as a cycle going through, you will find that there are ways to correlate the journey with the zodiac as a major archetype. And a lot of people speak of this as an archetypal journey of the soul, just like you could maybe map it onto the 78 cards of the Tarot and things like that. As a matter of fact, for those of you who are interested in literature, there is on the internet someone's dissertation, and they show how Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales goes twice through the zodiac. Okay? It's called Chaucer's Solar Pageant, I believe. And this person makes the argument that we do have Chaucer's little essay on the astrolabe, which is the first English writing we have on it on a scientific instrument. It's very cool. And in the end, he says, and I'll tell you more about how to use this for astrology, something like that. And this person argues that his Canterbury Tales are just tales meant to give the meanings of the zodiac signs, which is really kind of neat. But yet another thing to look at and to think, wait a minute, all of this was imbued. And, you know, Chaucer talked about the humors and all the rest, so it was obvious that he was knowledgeable. So those are the signs of the zodiac, you know, and we could go through all of them, but we don't have time for this, just being an introduction. All right, but you can start to get a sense of each of these from that. All right. Now, one of the critical things that you will find is that the planets are connected to the signs. Okay. Most of Western astrology talks about rulership. Okay, not quite the word that I would use. Nowadays, the people who are more in the know and who are looking at the older traditions talk about what's called essential dignities. Okay, because a planet can be either in good shape, able to do what it needs to do, okay, or in bad shape, in some sense. Planets can do one of three things, as my teacher Robert Zoller told me. A planet can make something happen. It can make something happen and destroy it, or it can prevent something from happening. And a lot of that depends on how good the planet is placed in the zodiac and in the cycle. And in order to determine that, the planets have different places that they are and different dignities within those. Now, the one dignity almost all astrologers will talk about is rulership, okay, which really is called domicile. Home, what's the home place for the planet? Where are they like the king in the castle, and they can get stuff done because the king just says it and it happens? Well, for a while I was lost as to why certain things had certain rulerships. But after digging around for long enough, here's what I had figured out. We start with the sun and moon, and the moon being the easiest to see, okay, since we could stare at it for a long time and not get our eyes burnt out. When is the moon in the strongest and best position? If the moon rules the night, okay, as I believe there's even a place in scripture, the sun rules the day, the moon rules the night. If it rules the night, where is it going to be full and up for more hours of the night than any other position? I see people thinking. Now, it's going to be a full moon, right? That's its power point, okay? Opposite the sun. And when is the longest night of the year?
No, solstice.
Winter solstice. So the sun would be in Capricorn, and the moon would be in Cancer. Okay? When the moon is full in Cancer, the sun will be going down at the earliest time of the year. The moon will be rising, and it will be up and full for more than 12, maybe 13, 14 hours. I forget how long nights are in the winter, and it depends on your latitude. And then it will set. it will be at its strongest point in Cancer. Okay? Cool. That makes sense. All right? Now, then we kind of have to work, well, wait, if that's the point, then where's the sun the strongest? And for that, we look to some of the seasons, and we know that, yeah, the sun moves into Cancer, and that's midsummer, but you get that lag of the heat, and really August, late July or August is going to be the strongest, and that's where you get the sun ruling Leo, okay? Strongest point in the climate. And remember, these things are connected in with hot, cold, wet, and dry, and all the rest. Now, from there, we then start to look at, guess what, that order again, okay? And we get Mercury ruling the 2 to each side. We get Mercury ruling Gemini and Virgo. Now, here's another little cycle. We have positive, negative, day, night, male, female, masculine, feminine, okay? And that cycle goes all the way through too. It's a twofold cycle. So Mercury rules the positive air element, a day sign, and a night sign of a mutable Earth. Okay? So each of the other planets rules a day and a night sign. Okay? So if we go to Venus, night sign Taurus, day sign Libra. If we go to Mars, night sign Scorpio, day sign Aries. We go to Jupiter, the night sign is Pisces, the day sign is Sagittarius, and Saturn gets these two up here at the top, Capricorn for night and Aquarius for day. All right. Now you notice that I have not put in modern planets. Modern planets, to my mind, do not rule signs because they do not fall into this archetypal schema. The modern planets, when they were found, because the rationale behind this and because the idea of essential dignities and the whole tradition in the East, in the West rather, of hot, cold, wet, and dry, and seasons and understanding all of that was lost. And people thought that the planets ruled a sign because they were like that sign. Okay? No, it's because they have the most power in that sign because they're efficacious. There are some similarities, okay? But it fits into this schema. What they started doing was they put Uranus here, okay, Uranus here, Neptune here, and there was a considerable fight when Pluto came in. A lot of people put Pluto at Aries, okay? But they finally decided, at least some of them, to put it into Scorpio, okay? But these planets are not visible. They don't fit into that schema. Now, there is another kind of rulership, and that is what are the things that are attributed to the correspondences. And Neptune has been shown to have cycles with the oil, supply and demand. Pluto, volcanoes, Uranus was right on the midheaven when the Hiroshima bomb went off, things like that. So as we look at events and their correlations, we start to see those. But for ruling signs and being stronger or weaker in a sign, I don't think so, not for the modern planets, okay? You will be led somewhat astray. So this means that each planet has a positive and a negative. So let's take one of my favorite examples. Mars, in Aries, will start a fight. Mars in Scorpio will damn well end it. Okay? If they're attacked, they will, because of the fixity, the intensity, the depth, okay? They will stay with it till the end. Okay? Mars might, in Aries, may poop out. Okay? Now, so just each one of these has these positive and negatives, so that can also help you to get an idea of, oh, is this planet in one of its rulerships? If so, it's going to do really well. Well, what about the other way? If Mars is over here on the other side of the zodiac in Libra, sorry folks, it's screwed. Okay? It's not where it wants to be. It's in the opposite side. So any of these planets that are in the opposite sign are going to be weakened because they're not of that nature. They're going to have a much harder time, and that's where you're going to get a planet that will either make something happen but then destroy it or prevent it altogether. Okay? So, one's weakened, one's softened, okay? Or made in a detriment, you know? Now, I won't go into all the other essential dignities. There are, in fact, 4 more, okay? One you will still hear in the West that's called, let's see now, rulership, exaltation, okay? And exaltation seems to be maybe an older system, okay, that existed, and perhaps there's a guy on the south side of Chicago who came up with an idea of what exaltation may be about based on when the sun is setting and how visible the planets are going to be at different points. But basically what happens there is when a planet is in its exalted sign, it's kind of like the king isn't in his castle, but he's at a birthday party somebody else is throwing. So nobody wants to piss him off either, okay? You're being celebrated. Sometimes a planet that's in its exaltation can be a little bit out of the way. It can be like partying too much, okay? There's also triplicity, where a planet is in one of 3 signs that gives it some ability to do its work. In fact, it's kind of lucky when it's in triplicity. Then there's another pattern that's called bounds or terms, and that takes each sign and divides it up into 5, but the 5 divisions are uneven for the 5 planets that aren't the sun or the moon. And if a planet is there, it's considered that it can do its work. And then you have face, which is a 3-fold division of the zodiac. And if a planet is in a face, it can manage something sort of, but it's like the day before your rent is due and you don't have it. Okay, so in fact, a planet that only has face dignity can sometimes be a bit on the nervous side. And Lee Lehman actually did a really nice study about this, showing how face dignity, in fact, almost isn't a dignity because the planet gets so nervous that it's about to run out, okay? In any case, so those are where these 2 things combine. You can get an idea of how they fit together, all right? Let me make sure that I'm keeping somewhere in here. Okay, houses. I'm going to give you a very brief. Now, the nice thing about houses is, once you get 6 of them, you can start to get the mnemonics and derive all the rest of the meanings. And I'll show you how to do that. All right? Can this flip, or no, I'll just...
Can I?
It has on wheels, you can spin it.
You
Ah.
can spin it.
Okay. You need to take a picture? Go for it.
Thank you so much.
All right. And, yeah. That way I won't spend time on... So very quickly, we have the horizon in most house systems, okay? And if you want to start a fight at an astrology conference, ask them which house system they use, and then tell them, oh, that's crap. Okay? Because there are at least a dozen ways of dividing up for the houses. But I'm going to talk in generalities here, okay? So here's the horizon, okay? Here's east. Now, the reason why these things are backwards from how we look at maps is because when you were in ancient Chaldea or whatever, and you were trying to make a map of the heavens, you'd be facing south because all the planets are going to be south, okay? So you draw a piece of paper, you go, okay, south, okay? The sun up here is at the top, okay? And over here things are rising, so this is the east. And over here on the piece of paper, oh, they're about to go down west, and that leaves us north for anything below the ground, okay? Just, it does make sense when you think about it, okay? So a planet that's about to come up is in the first house, the next is in the second, and then the third one that comes up, it's here. So look, you know, it's just, the numbering does make sense if you think about it with that rotation. By the way, the rotation is called primary motion, okay? that sphere of the that carries the planets and all the rest along is called the primary motion. And in some methods of prediction, one of the oldest ones that, in fact, Ptolemy and people have resurrected lately, it's called primary progression. Okay? In any case, so 10th, 11th, and 12th. Okay? Now, really quickly, the first house is you. You yourself. The house of the person themselves. This also means their constitution, your general health, things like that. Okay, pretty easy. Second, the house of things you own, your possessions. Okay? Why? Because right next to you is the stuff you own. All right? Third is, well, you've got to not sit in one place, so you're going to go on short journeys. What's the neighborhood? And also, people that are close to you, brothers and sisters, okay? But that's a little derivative. The fourth is the property that you're on, okay? And your inheritance, okay? So also the house of father. Modern astrology has this mixed up. They say the mother is there because they make the mistake of correlating this with the sign of Cancer. But the father is here, and this is land and immovable wealth. The fifth is, let's see now, short-term fun is one way of looking at it. This is the arts. This is performance. This is the stage, theater. This is gambling. This is also children. And if you're not having fun at sex, you're doing it wrong. So this is the house of sexuality. You will see modern astrologers place this in the 8th. They are wrong. Okay? That attribution didn't start until the 20th century. 6th house is the house of slaves. Huh? Well, things that you have that make some sense, that are things that are useful. In modern psychological astrology, it's your abilities, okay? But it's also other things that may be of some use, like animals, okay? And these are animals smaller than sheep or smaller. When you become a professional astrologer in certain places, they give you a sample sheet. So, I'm just kidding. All right, so slaves, sheep, thing or smaller. This is also illness. Okay. It's a little bit of everything there. A traditional name was House of Slaves. Now, remember I said we have this interesting kind of correlation. Remember that a planet in one sign, the opposite. So there's an opposite kind of thing going on with the houses too. So if this is, and you can derive these others from this, and then I'll show you a really cool trick. If this is self, what is this? Others, not self. Or partners. Partners could be a partner in a game, like an enemy, your sports opponent. It could be a spouse. It could be an open enemy, somebody who's suing you. Okay? But it is others. The other person in general. In geomantic divination, when we're doing the house system, this becomes any generic other person. Okay? Now, if this is what you own, hey, how about this is what the other person owns? Okay? So others' property is one meaning. Okay? Now, the most common though is this is something that you don't hold. It's something that you can't grasp. And if you take that metaphor to further out, you get to meanings like death and the occult. Things that are mysterious, that are wholly ungrabbable, okay? It's that place that you go where you're just unsure of. And so occult matters, hidden matters, things like that. Short journeys, long journeys. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. In the Middle Ages, in ancient times even, if you went on a long journey, what were you doing? It was a pilgrimage. So this is the religion of the masses, okay? This is also, oh gee, I've got to go to court. That's 60 miles away to see the magistrate, okay? It's a long journey. It's also learning and connection to the masses, because another reason for pilgrimage was to go and learn something, such as what Pythagoras did. Wander around places and go and meet all the wise people, hang out in Alexandria, whatever. So long journeys is connected in with the courts, with universities, with pilgrimage, and the spirituality of the majority. Which, by the way, then gives you an idea of the spirituality of the minority is third house. Okay? It's another way of looking at it. Is the mother, but it's also the most public side of yourself, because part of this is things that are to yourself are below the horizon, things that are more public is above the horizon, and the thing that shines in the light of day is your occupation. Okay? The 11th house, if this is short-term fun, this is long-term plans.
Helen, a quick question.
Yeah.
If there's a correlation between 10th and 4th,
Mm-hmm.
would it also mean, like, if there is mother, father, but land in the 4th house, would that be your connection?
You inherited from your father.
Okay,
Yeah, most of those rules. Okay.
so it's not a religious connotation for connection to the land?
No,
Okay.
not that I'm aware of. 12th house, finally, let me give you, from the book that I recommend, there's a wonderful scenario to understand the 12th house. Imagine that you're sitting on a bench outside of the courthouse. In the morning, you just filed for bankruptcy, and in the afternoon, you just completed your divorce. There's two ways that you can feel sitting on that bench. You can feel, oh my God, it's over. Or you can feel, oh my God, it's over. 12th house experiences are like that, okay? Depending on how you see it. In modern astrological parlance, it's the house of self-transcendence. In older terms, it's the house of troubles. Because these character building things typically are not things that we want to go through. And it's how do you shoot yourself in the foot, okay? So, we've got all of that, and these are very basic meanings, right? Now, here's something that I learned from horary astrology, and I'm going to go through different branches kind of quickly. But horary is where you have a question, and it's a burning question, and you ask me, and I do a chart for right now, and I can answer your question. All right? It's a form of divination. And it was actually very popular in medieval times because most people didn't know when they were born. So you did a chart for the birthplace and time of the question. And you could get some really cool and accurate answers that way. But in order to do that, what was the subject of the question? And so the house was the critical thing. If your fish was stolen, where were your fish? Well, it's, things that you own. So you had to look at the ruler of that house and that sort of thing. So they figured out, maybe even before that, but I know that the highest use of this following trick was in horary astrology. Remember I said that here's the other person and this is what they own? Okay? Well, this is their brothers and sisters. Okay? This is that other person's father. This is that other person's ability to have fun. Okay? this is where the other person shoots themselves in the foot. So imagine that you can take this dial of the houses and simply kind of spin the dial to get further meanings from the houses. So for instance, if your brothers and sisters are down here, then this is what your brothers and sisters own, okay? And this is their brothers and sisters, like maybe you only have a half-brother, okay? Or this is the short journey they're going to go on. So if you go to a horary astrologer and say, my brother's going on this trip, you know, and it's less than 200 miles, but will he make any profit from it? You know, well, here's the trip, and then there's going to be another place for the profit from the trip. But basically, you take everything from starting from there. So you have your minister's money, your minister's brothers and sisters, your minister's wife. So you can start to derive all of these from just spinning that dial around. So here's my favorite thing. Your dog's fleas. Okay, here's you. Where's your animal? Sixth. Now it's got an animal. Okay, so here's its first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Your dog's fleas is the 11th house. Okay, remember, this is the important thing is to count from 1 here. Okay, these are numbers that start with this, not a 0. So it wouldn't be over here 1, 2, 3. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so your dog's fleas are over there. In the same way, problems that you will have from sex are 4th house, because here's sexuality, and the 12th house from the 4th is the problems of it. So any house, any attribute, the one right before it is going to be the one that will show you where the problems are. The ruler of the nation is the 10th house. And where did the rulers run into problems sometimes? Henry VIII, the church. Okay, there can oftentimes be an antagonistic thing there. Okay, so that's houses. So one way of looking at this is you have the actors, okay, and you have the role that they're playing, which is the zodiac sign, and you have where they're doing it, which is the house. Nice little metaphor for things. So if you put things together, here's one example. Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop.
It's not a tumor.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, a very Martian kind of character, right? He's in Cancer, the mothering sign, okay? Does Mars in Cancer do well? No, that's why it was being used for comedic effect, okay? And it's probably in the 4th house of childhood and taking care of kids, okay? So you can do all sorts of interesting things with this. And in fact, let me show you something very briefly. I need 4 volunteers, okay? 4, come on up to the front, form a line. 3 of you. Now, form a line this way. This way, over there, over here.
Ah,
Okay,
yes.
yeah, there.
We don't
there.
follow direction line.
There, okay, good. You're going to be the subject, okay? Now, there's a little branch of astrology called experiential astrology, okay? Which I'll get into in a bit. But you can actually start to get the feel for zodiac signs from doing experiences, okay? So, I'd like you gentlemen to keep your line. She's going to try and break through it. You're going to try and walk through them. Right. Notice what it's like, okay? Now, I want you to notice also what's your feeling of not being able to cut through, okay? Notice there's like, oh my God, can I do this? All right, okay? Now, there are a number of strategies that you could use, okay? There's directly pushing through, okay? Right? Give that a try, see what it feels like, okay? It's resistance, and notice the feeling in yourself too, Okay, can I do this? Can I get through these guys? Okay. Then there's
That's not a stance that I would take. She might take a different tack.
yes, and that's entirely possible to take that tack, okay? And the way of doing that tack would be maybe a different kind of sign or a different way, right? Okay? If I was Martian trying to get through these guys, okay, I might do the direct, okay, rah! Okay? If I was being that's Mars in Aries. If I was being Mars in Scorpio, I might like, look over there. Okay? A little tricky, deceptive, all right? Or I might want to, duck underneath their legs, all right? Now, what I just put up there was a barrier, okay? So this is a Aries kind of experience, fighting through the line, okay? Now, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to give you a different sign, all right? Now, each of you three line up one in a row, okay? Yes. And these are stations, and each of them is going to ask you a question, all right? And you have to get the answer correct, okay? So come up with questions, okay? He's first.
What time is it?
The clock to tell you that.
Yes. Give him the answer.
About 12:23.
Okay, good. He passes you on to the next one. Notice what it's like. You got confronted with something you had to answer, but now you're moving, okay? And you get to the next stage.
What's 6 times 3?
6 times 18.
Great. Now you get to the last stage.
What do you want?
Food, actually.
Good. Okay?
Good answer.
Now, this movement has a mutable quality. Questions have an intellectual side. This could be considered a Virgo experience. Okay? Get the idea?
Yeah.
All right? You can all sit down. There's a little piece there of experiential astrology. And if folks want to get together, one of the better ways of doing astrological study to get it into your bones, get a group of people together and come up with exercises like this. Okay? What would it be like to go through a Scorpio experience? And what I do with that is I have people imagine that they're right at their deaths and trying to see what it is in their life that had meaning. All right? If they're going through a Virgo process like that, what are the questions? Okay? If they're challenged with, okay, now be a Leo, it's like, okay, how do I feel being on stage? Okay? And what happens is your own chart will interact with that. Okay? If you don't have a lot of Aries in your chart, being confronted with 3 guys that you've got to fight through, okay, might be more of a challenge than if you have 4 planets in Aries. Okay? Very different kind of thing. Now, it's been said that the first experiential astrologer in the West was a guy named Marsilio Ficino. He wrote a book called 3 Books on Life, which interestingly enough was also the very first directory of occupational medicine. Because really what it was doing was saying, what do you do with all these melancholy scholars? Okay? You give them experiences that are opposite to melancholia. Okay? And so Ficino had those kinds of things. And of course, the whole idea of creating talismans and things to create the opposite effect is also somewhat experiential too. But in any case, that's some stuff that you can do. You can also think, what's some music, that would fit each of these signs? Listen to them. Pulse the planets is really nice to be able to get that. I mean, dun, 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 that whole opening of Mars, okay, gives you the feeling for the planet Mars, but also that's really kind of Mars in Aries is what he's doing with that, okay? So one of the things that's really good when you have trouble memorizing this stuff, if you really want to get it in your gut, go through these kinds of experiences, listen to them, see what fits, any kind of poem you can project onto and see what are some of the things that might fit with that, Here's an example of, here's Mars and Cancer, okay? She hears me strike the board and say that she is under ban of all good men and women being mentioned with a man who has the worst of all bad names. And thereupon replies, but his hair is beautiful, cold as the March wind, his eyes. There goes that Mars, totally dissolved in Cancer. What's a dad going to do? That's from A Woman Young and Old by Yeats. You know, I love it because of that contrast. You know, really neat. So, ways to learn some of these basics. Let me go briefly. We're almost out of time, and I still have to run through things kind of quickly. Ladder history. We have all of this astrology that happened, and then Copernicus came along, which was an excuse. Okay, if you talk to some modern historians, they'll say, oh, the Copernican revolution is what destroyed astrology. Actually, the English Civil War had something to do with that, according to one of my teachers, because the English Civil War got all of Europe, all of the royalty, really kind of nervous, okay? If they could start deposing kings and things like that. And what they found was that, oh, astrology and all these almanacs were very powerful propaganda tools for both sides in the English Civil War. So one thought is that the nobility started to disparage astrology as one way of taking away a propaganda tool. Also, yes, at the same time, roughly, there was Copernicus, although, interestingly enough, there was strong scientific evidence to argue with Copernicus at the time. They did not have good telescopes. They did not know the actual size of stars, and some of those things were critical questions that really were not fixed until later when we got better instruments. In addition, Copernicus ran into his own problems not having ellipses for orbits, and a lot of people don't know this, but Copernicus in his system actually had epicycles, the planets going around in little circles as they're going around the sun to try and correct for that fact that they weren't perfect circles. So there were problems with Copernicus and whatnot, but astrology fell out of favor. And then what wound up happening, especially on the English side of things, is it dropped out of being studied. The Latin and the Greek manuscripts weren't looked at. And in the 1800s and the early 1900s, not many people were doing much with it except for maybe a few theosophists. And because Freud came along and because some of them got charged with fortune telling, they got up in court and said, no, this isn't fortune telling, it's psychology. And what wound up happening as a result of that was it started to get watered down in the 20th century. Now, let me say that I can look at a chart, and being a psychotherapist, I can start to sort things out and get a fairly good idea of what's going on with the person, especially when I'm in dialogue with them about what their chart is about, so that I'm not projecting, but rather saying, this is what these symbols could mean. How's the feeling of that in your life? And you will see that these things start to fit together. So the chart can easily be extrapolated to a psychological instrument. But that's not all that it was. It literally, the only part of you that was yourself was that first house in medieval and Renaissance astrology. Everything else was the stuff in your life and the things that you owned and the people. Okay? So, very different way of looking at things. Plus, they didn't understand about essential dignities, which I talked to you about earlier. They didn't understand the very basis in the Western tradition, the hot, cold, wet, dry, the whole sense of seasons and how all of these fit together. So a lot of it got lost. And then somebody put in predictions for the royal family in a newspaper, and at the end of that column, they said, oh, if your birth date is from here to here, you'll find these kinds of things happening. There was a guy who came up with and invented sun sign astrology, and the newspaper sold better. And they said, can you do this some more? And that's where all of those columns came from. Okay? Yes, because the sun is the only regular one that you can tell for groups of people. Okay? Let me give you a little hint. Okay? If you want to make good use of sun sign columns, don't do the daily ones. Okay? Do weekly to monthly. Okay? That'll at least give you kind of the climate that you're in. Don't use your sun sign, use your rising sign. It'll increase the accuracy more. But remember, this is gonna be kind of like a weather forecast, okay? The day might rain, but there may be sunshine too, okay? But it'll tell you if there's gonna be some rain roughly, okay? That's the best way to make use of these sun sign columns, okay? Use your rising sign, that's really you, much more. I'm much more of a Capricorn, because that's my rising sign. Yes, I've got a lot of planets in Pisces. That'd be easy to see for a psychological astrologer. But Capricorn is really pretty strong for me. Okay, for God's sakes, I'm in black. It's Capricornian, you know? So, let me crunch the rest of this. Just to give you an idea of all the different branches of astrology, and some of them are written on the back of your handout here too. There's mundane astrology that looks at things, political astrology basically, and weather. It looks at finances, what's going on with the stock market, what's going on with the price of beans, what's going on with the political situations and when will things change. There's birth horoscope, and there's all sorts of ways of looking at these birth charts. There is the German system that looks at not just where the planets are, but where are the points of where the planet's energies come together. So if you have Mars energy and Sun energy, that midpoint is going to move as those planets move, and you'll be able to predict things from the blend of those two energies. There's humanistic astrology, which came out of the 60s, okay? Dane Rudhyar has almost incomprehensible books written on that, because he's so, anyway. Evolutionary astrology is something relatively recent, mostly based on Pluto. That's the usual use for the term. There are entire courses on it. You can do all sorts of analysis of Pluto. The classical schools, Greek and medieval stuff, in the last 15, 20 years, we've started to translate all of that. And we've started to resurrect these old ideas. We've gotten systems of prediction now that are much more accurate. When I started studying medieval astrology, I asked Robert Zoller, why do I want to learn this old stuff? And he said, because they were accurate in prediction. And I said, why was that? He says, because if they weren't, their heads got chopped off. So they understood certain things. And there's experiential, which I gave you a little bit of an idea of. In the highest level of experiential, it's really kind of cool. They actually have done this a few times. You hire a bunch of actors, and you get the person's chart. And you get the person standing there, and the actors are told, what's the scene? And it could be Mars in Cancer square a Venus in Libra. And they're told how to act these, and then they combine, and they go, is that familiar? Sometimes the person's in tears. They say, yes! How do you know what's going on in my head? Okay. Horary has just been resurrected in the last 30 years. There are wonderful courses out there, some of them extremely expensive, but it's a wonderful branch. I mentioned that earlier. Ask the question, get the answer. The highest level of this, the favorite example is, there's an astrologer named Alfie Lavoie, former NFL hockey player. Now he's a financial astrologer and does horary. Somebody called him and said, Grandpa's will is somewhere in the house. We haven't been able to find it. We've torn it all apart. The message was left on his machine. He took the time that he got the message, did the chart, called them up and said, it's in the attic in a metal box behind panels of wood. Knock along and see where the hollow space is. He nailed it. Okay? Electional astrology is where you're trying to elect to find the right time to do something. Okay? There are many systems of that, some of them more complex, some easier. Medical astrology, yeah, there's modern medical. There's also the classical medical where you have to really understand the humors, and things are not described as this is a pneumonia, this is, a wind in this, blah, 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 okay? Predictive astrology, there's all sorts of different approaches to that, lots of different schools and methods. And then other cultures, Vedic and Hindu, okay? Huge courses. There's actually a guy here in Chicago who's really good at that and teaches. If you're interested, I can let you know. There's Burmese astrology, Mahabot, which is actually a relatively simple system. I hope to learn that at some point. Chinese astrology, completely different, okay? You really have to understand Chinese philosophy to get into that. But once you do, you then have mastery of Chinese medicine and Chinese martial arts and all the rest. Mayan astrology, somebody has sort of resurrected it from what we can figure out. There's one guy who's actually made a decent attempt at it. Tibetan astrology still exists. It's a sidereal astrology, mostly done by Tibetan monks who are in exile. And then there's all the made-up ones, like Native American and Celtic and all the rest, which could be at best be defined as unverified personal gnosis in these regards. Okay? Resources for study. On the back of the sheet, I talk about all the different types. Beginners books. Listen, there is one book that if you're going to learn, yes, it's psychological, but you don't get a good writer who's also a good astrologer very often. That book is called The Inner Sky. It's by Stephen Forrest, okay? At one point, he got a phone call from somebody saying, "Your book is really wonderful. Would you like an endorsement from me?" He goes, well, thank you for the comment. Who is this? "Oh, I sing in a band called The Police." So on the front of the book cover is a blurb from Sting, okay? So that, Astrology Alive is for experiential astrology. The Changing Sky is Forrest's book on prediction, which is also pretty good. He also has a book that he wrote with his wife, Sky Mates, volume 1 and 2, for, how do two people and their horoscopes combine. Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark, I actually like better than Forrest's book. That gives you really solid stuff about predictive astrology. And then Prediction in Astrology by Noel Till. It's out of print, worth finding. His Solar Arcs is the next best thing if you can't find that one. Till has his own way of putting things. He's very much a modern astrologer, but it's a nice book. The Classical Revival, I give you websites there for people if you want to learn the old stuff and really get a handle on it and get a good idea of what the tradition is, where it fits into everything. Benjamin Dykes is a PhD philosopher who started to translate things after he studied with my teacher, Robert Zoller. Rob Hand, who now has a PhD from Catholic University, he did his dissertation on the use of astrology in the Italian civil wars, and especially Bonatti and all of that. And Lee Lehman, who's a PhD actually in botany, and could tell you a lot of things about Culpeper and astrology that way, but she's also one of the world's experts on these older forms of classical astrology like horary, electional, and whatnot. Always good resources, and any books by them or translations by them are really good. Folks, we've already run a little over, even though I started late. Hopefully I've given you at least a taste of this, why it's important, why you want to start to get and study and get an idea of this, because it weaves into the warp and woof of the Western esoteric tradition. And hopefully this will be a good beginning for you and an idea of at least what this domain is like. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it.